Amara stood in the hospital hallway, bloody scrubs on her hands, tears burning down her cheeks, after saving a white child's life. But instead of thanks, security shoved her against the wall, demanding to know why she touched someone else's baby. The parents watched in silence. The doctor turned away. Then someone pulled out a phone and pressed record. What happens next shattered the country. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. In a palace of privilege, the loudest silence was the cry of a child never held by his own father. The Langford estate sat like a forgotten cathedral on the cliffs of the Hamptons, draped in glass and steel but hollow at its core. Designed by architects known more for ego than empathy, the mansion echoed with emptiness. Room after room breathed wealth but exhaled grief, most of it silent, all of it unspoken. At the center of it all was Preston Langford III, a man so numb with loss that he'd built emotional walls taller than the hedges surrounding his empire. Preston hadn't always been cold. Once he'd been a man capable of laughter, even tenderness. But that died the day his wife, Eleanor, bled out on the operating table, leaving behind a newborn son and a husband who blamed the child for surviving. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. Everyone in the mansion felt it. Miles Langford, just 3 months old, lived like an heir to a throne no one wanted to guard, fed by rotating nannies, bathed by emotionless hands, rocked by machines designed to mimic affection. He had a nursery the size of an apartment, yet not a single toy bore signs of use. His cries echoed down marble halls and into the ears of staff trained to keep their distance. Enter Amara Baines, 30 years old, with skin kissed by southern sun, and eyes that had seen too much too young. Once a pediatric nurse in Atlanta, Amara had fled the profession after a whistleblowing scandal left her blacklisted and broke. She needed work. The Langfords needed staff. It was that simple. Or so she thought. Her first day began with a contract full of clauses. No photography, no personal conversations with Preston, no maternal gestures toward the child. Do your job. Nothing more, barked Gerald Wicks, the ex-cop head of security, whose badge still glinted in his tone. No touching unless absolutely necessary. We don't need blurred lines around here. The subtext wasn't subtle. A black woman in a white empire, she was to be invisible, efficient, silent, and contained. Amara nodded, even smiled politely, but inside a storm stirred. She knew how they saw her. The other maids whispered when she passed about her hair, her accent, the modest clothes she wore that somehow still offended. One even muttered, "She walks like she owns the place." As Amara left the laundry room, she didn't respond. She never did. She had learned long ago dignity was her armor. Her duty started with linens and dusting, but soon extended to helping with Miles during shift gaps. At first she kept her distance following the rules, avoiding eye contact. But children have a way of unmaking walls. Miles would follow her with his eyes, quiet when she entered, restless when she left. His small hands began to reach for her. His whimpers softened when she sang under her breath. Then came the night. Everything changed. It was near midnight when she heard it. His cries slicing through the silence like broken glass. They weren't hungry cries. They were aching, desperate. Amara hesitated outside the nursery door, her hand trembling on the knob. Where was the night nanny? She peeked in, empty crib but for the wailing baby, and no one else in sight. She checked the monitors. Nothing. She checked the hallway. Empty. Downstairs she caught a glimpse of Preston, glass in hand, slouched on a leather couch, eyes deadened by a scotch he hadn't earned. The baby screamed louder. Her breath caught. Her training kicked in. Her heart rebelled. She entered. "Shh," she whispered, picking him up gently, rocking him in arms that had once held dying infants and newborns alike. "I know, baby. I know." But he wouldn't stop. His face was red, gasping between sobs. She tried the formula bottle left out. He rejected it violently, and then an impulse born not from defiance but from pure aching humanity. She made a decision, looking around the empty room, her fingers trembling. Amara adjusted her blouse. She hadn't nursed in years, but instinct returned like breath to lungs. Holding him close, she guided him, and he latched, greedily, desperately. Silence. The kind of silence that isn't absence, but peace. Her body tensed, tears welling without permission. Not because of guilt, but because she had forgotten what it meant to feel needed. Truly needed. Miles's eyes closed slowly, his fists unclenching against her skin. For the first time, his little body relaxed in someone's arms. She didn't notice the tiny red dot blinking silently in the corner of the ceiling. A security camera, always on, always watching. Downstairs, Gerald Wicks stared into the flickering surveillance room. Sipping his cold coffee, something flickered on the monitor. He leaned forward, squinted, and froze. His jaw clenched. His cup hit the desk with a loud thud. "Maury," he muttered, calling the IT tech. "Pull Camgen 12. Now." "What time frame?" the sleepy voice asked. "Right now," Gerald growled. "This just turned into something else." In the nursery, Amara gently lowered Miles back into his crib. He whimpered once, then curled into sleep. She fixed her blouse, kissed her fingers, and brushed them over his forehead. Her face was unreadable, part guilt, part defiance, mostly heartbreak. She didn't know eyes were already on her. Or that tomorrow, the entire world would be too. She doesn't know a security camera just caught the moment. The surveillance room was dim and humming, a grid of monitors flickering like detached eyes. Gerald Wicks sat alone in the commanding chair, his posture taut, shoulders rigid. On one screen, camera 12 replayed the scene from minutes ago, in slow, chilling clarity. Amara Baines, breastfeeding little Miles Langford in the silent nursery. The baby's face, pressed against her chest, went from red and anguish to calm and sated. The only sound was silence, save for a soft sucking and the gentle rising and falling of Amara's blouse. Gerald felt an unsettling rush of heat in his chest. This wasn't just a breach of protocol. This was a rupture in the order he'd spent years guarding. He cleared his throat, steadying himself before flicking through the timestamps, labeling the footage, archiving it with precision. "Maury," he rasped into the intercom. His voice cracked, urgent. "Tag this as Incident Class 2. Timestamp 0138 AM. Label unauthorized contact." There was no judgment in his tone, more something colder, deeper, like betrayal. He looped the footage again, frame by silent frame. Amara did not hesitate. She held that child as if his existence demanded it. To Gerald, her calm confidence breached an unspoken boundary. A black woman maternal, with a white billionaire's air, without instruction, without permission. That violation rested heavy on him. He exported a copy onto an encrypted thumb drive, his insurance policy against any lapse in control. By 6:45 a.m., the mansion had awakened. The hum of tread polishing, glass polishing, flower arranging, furniture shifting, everything rehearsed to reinforce its immaculate facade. The rich smell of fresh pastries drifted from the breakfast room. Overseers in crisp uniforms walked straight backs, and a singular thought: preserve the Langford illusion. Upstairs, however, the silence pressed in the hidden corridors, thicker than wallpaper, heavier than grief. Inside the master office, Preston Langford III sat with the thumb drive in front of him. The laptop glowed with the recording. He began the playback with clinical calm. At first his expression was blank, as though the looped video were a slide of aesthetics, symmetry, lighting, shapes. But as the seconds trickled, his jaw tightened. The video played through once, twice, 3 times. After that he leaned forward, as if trying to absorb meaning through the screen itself. Gerald stood by the desk, arms rigid, features stoic, but vigilant. He finally spoke, voice low and controlled. "You saw that. You know what she did." His eyes flicked to Preston, awaiting direction. Preston didn't answer at first. He closed the lid of the laptop, leaned back in the leather chair, then glanced up. "Keep it private for now." His words were measured, clipped and chilling. Gerald's face twitched in incredulity. "Private? Sir, with respect, this is not safe. Any leak media, investors board. It becomes our disaster. Not just you, but the whole company. A black maid breastfeeding your heir. They'll spin this into a social crisis." Preston reached a hand toward the window, sunlight slanting across his suit, casting stripes on the expensive wood floor. He didn't flinch. "I understand the risk, but I also understand control. So we keep it internal." Gerald clenched his jaw, irritation burning bright behind his eyes. "Yes, sir." But he didn't dismiss the look in his eyes. Frustration, dismay, and something like betrayal. He left the office with the drive hidden in his pocket, a ghost with a secret fire in his veins. Downstairs, in the labyrinth of marble corridors and hush-toned walls, Amara sensed the shift before anyone said anything. It began with the silence of the staff. At breakfast, they avoided eye contact, Whispers snuffed out mid-sentence when she entered the room. The personal chef placed fruit skewers on her table with stiff precision. The towels in the laundry room lay crisp but colder. She pressed her lips shut tighter now, folding linens with a clumsy rigor, every motion mechanical, every breath measured. She felt the weight of invisible eyes, cameras and colleagues alike. In the breakfast room, one maid, Jo, cleared her throat. "Heard things," she said carefully, her voice hollow but edged with curiosity. "About last night, with the baby." Amara's chest tightened. She stared at her hands as they trembled. She halted. The ache of disbelief gathered behind her eyes. "People talk," Jo continued softly, head tilted. "They say you got too close." Amara's lips parted. "Close to what?" Jo shrugged, casually indifferent, before turning away. A hot flush pressed to Amara's neck, and she retreated, her composure fraying, but her guilt absent. Her love for the child, still. At that same moment, Preston watched from a camera feed. Amara, returning Miles to the crib, adjusting his sleep onesie, smoothing down stray curls. His posture had shifted. Before she'd entered the room with purpose, now she paused at the door, quiet, uncertain, as though the gulf between her duty and her emotion had suddenly grown undeniable. Watching her like that felt different. It felt consequential. Later in the day, Gerald's door clicked open, and Preston invited him in. The room smelled of aged wood and old decisions. Preston closed the blinds on noisy gossip and leaned on his desk. "She's visible," he said quietly. "Not angry, just observant." Gerald's mouth tightened. "Yes. Too visible. If she's bold enough to nurse your son, imagine what else she might do given the chance." Preston let out a sigh heavier than any sorrow. "People need something to cling to. That camera feed gives them permission to judge me. Judge her, judge everything." Gerald shifted in his chair. "Permission?" he echoed. "Sir, people won't ask permission. They'll take it. They already have." Preston nodded silently. He turned away, going over the estate's CCTV map, as though it were a battlefield. Gerald watched him, wondering if the man was planning damage control, or something more. Later in the nursery, Amara stood leaning over the crib. Miles slept. The room was quiet and cool. Light from a side window painted slats of gold across his face. Amara paused, closing her eyes, resting her forehead against the crib's side. She whispered a farewell to her exhaustion, a vow not to collapse just yet. She didn't hear the door swing open. Preston entered without warning. She started, whisking away, her heart pounding like a drum. "Mr. Langford." "Sir." He held up a hand. "It's okay." She didn't trust it. "Not yet." "I watched what I saw," he said softly. Not accusingly, not congratulatory, simply stating fact. Amara stiffened, searching his face. He continued. "I also saw what happened afterward." She stared, breath arrested between fear and relief. "I know you didn't break anything. You didn't harm him." Her throat fluttered. I just couldn't let him cry. He was in pain." He nodded. "I understand." Her eyes brimmed. "I don't want trouble, sir. He held up his hand again. "I know. But the world doesn't see like I do. Understand that it's not only about us anymore." Amara swallowed, confusion and hope colliding. "Sir, what happens now?" Preston exhaled slowly. "For now, nothing. I'll say nothing." She bit her lip, gathering composure. He turned and walked out without another word. She remained by the crib, feeling unmoored. That evening, late at night, Preston sat by a large bay window overlooking manicured gardens. His balcony doors were open, letting in a faint breeze. He held his phone without looking. It buzzed nonstop. He swiped, opening Twitter, Instagram, and news notifications. The footage had exploded. Thousands of retweets, reposts, heated opinions, cynical memes. Headlines screamed, "Langford estate nanny breaches protocol. White billionaire's baby nursed by black maid." Terms loaded with racial charge and moral outrage. Comments were savage. "Fire her. She's a thief, stealing blackness. How dare a black woman touch a white infant? She's the real mother, and he stole her milk." Preston's vision blurred. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the feed hadn't changed, but he had. He felt controlled no longer, fractured. Something in him cracked, and beyond guilt, his grief for the child, now turned public, groped in that fracture. He breathed out and deleted the encrypted file, saying silently, "We can't handle this." He locked the office, retreated upstairs. The estate lights dimmed as night swallowed the wealth. In the security office, Gerald sat in the flickering glow of monitors. He pulled the same footage, that same drive, only this time, he clicked upload, choosing a top-tier viral site, changing the metadata, anonymizing the source. It was done. He leaned back, satisfaction swirling in his chest like smoke. Tomorrow the world would wake, and someone else would carry the weight. Gerald anonymously uploads the footage online, setting off a digital firestorm. When a black woman gives love, the world calls it theft. The video struck like a digital lightning bolt, sharp, blinding, and unavoidable. What began as a silent act of comfort inside a quiet nursery was now a national spectacle bleeding through every screen in America. Within hours of Gerald's anonymous upload, Twitter transformed into a digital battlefield. The trending hashtag #MilkGate exploded. At its epicenter, a grainy, infrared-tinged clip of Amara Baines cradling Miles Langford to her breast. There were no words in the video, only action, and that, it seemed, was enough. "Black Maid breastfeeds white billionaire's baby," screamed the first wave of headlines. TikTok duets stitched the footage with outrage, satire, and commentary. Some framed Amara as a predator, others painted her as a savior. But none allowed her silence. "Unbelievable," muttered a news anchor on cable. "Is this nurturing or crossing a moral boundary?" The next anchor didn't hesitate. What would drive a domestic employee to do something so intimate with someone else's child? Then came the memes. Some turned the image into a grotesque joke. Amara's face photoshopped onto Harriet Tubman's body, holding a Gucci-clad baby. Others used captions like, "Got milk?" or "From the projects to the penthouse." The dehumanization was efficient, algorithmic, and cruel. Meanwhile, Amara sat at the far end of the Langford estate, inside a modest guest room that felt more like a holding cell. Her phone, once a link to her small world, her mother, her brother Dorian, her church, now vibrated with venom. Messages piled in, some offering support, many dripping with racial hate. She didn't open them all. She couldn't. Poor manipulator. Should have known better. "You just want a piece of the estate." Amara stared at the blank wall ahead, her breath shallow, hands folded tightly in her lap. The house that once whispered behind her back now roared outside her door. "I didn't mean for any of this," she said quietly, mostly to herself. Outside her room, the staff spoke louder now, emboldened by what they assumed was the truth. "Thought she was better than us. She was always too close to that baby." Guess she knew exactly what she was doing. The sting wasn't in their words. It was in the echo of them, in the unmasking of what they'd always believed. Preston Langford watched it all unfold from his study. News alerts pinged nonstop. He swiped through articles that showed his last name next to slurs, debates, threats. He stared at one tweet for several minutes. Funny how billionaires protect their wealth better than they protect their children. He had prepared for scandal in the abstract. Lawsuits, bad press, market fluctuation. But this was different. This was racialized, weaponized intimacy. It wasn't about policy anymore. It was about ownership. His advisors urged immediate damage control. One statement: denounce the video, fire the woman, reclaim the narrative. But he didn't. Instead, he closed the blinds and opened a folder of old photos of Eleanor, his late wife, holding a younger version of herself inside a Brooklyn NICU. She had once told him, "We don't choose who we trust with our babies. We feel it." And yet, here he was, letting the world decide how to feel. He said nothing publicly. He only watched the stock ticker dip, point by point. Langford International, once ironclad, was now bleeding in red. Then came the protests. It started with a small group: college students, mothers, civil rights organizers. They stood at the estate gates, with signs that read, "Black women deserve dignity. Motherhood isn't a crime," and "Tell the whole story." News vans followed. Drones hovered. One protester live-streamed herself chanting, "We're not your mammies." The clip went viral. Overnight, more protesters joined. What began as a media scandal had become a civil rights spectacle. Inside the mansion, Amara felt the weight of their chants like thunder through the floorboards. But it didn't feel like protection. It felt like pressure. She wasn't ready to be anyone's symbol. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was worse. She opened the message and gasped. Her old mugshot, A pixelated image of her 23-year-old self, eyes red from crying, head wrapped in a scarf. The charge trespassing and obstruction. A case dismissed, expunged, but now dragged back into the court of public opinion. Beneath it, the caption read, "Is this the woman who held your billionaire baby?" Then her brother's face, her mother's Facebook photos. Even a quote from a college ex-boyfriend she hadn't spoken to in a decade. She always had a savior complex, thought she knew better than everyone. Amara turned her phone off and placed it face down. "I can't breathe," she whispered, tears building behind her eyes. "I can't." The door creaked. Preston stood there, quiet, hands in his pockets. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Amara looked up, eyes sharp. "For what? For what they're saying? Or for not stopping it?" He didn't answer. "Because I held your baby like he mattered. Because I gave him what no one else would. And now I'm the monster?" "You're not," Preston said, voice low. "But the machine doesn't care." She stood, anger trembling beneath her skin. "You're powerful enough to stop it. And you're choosing silence." Preston exhaled. "I don't want to make things worse." Amara shook her head slowly. "You already did." That night, a conservative TV host teased a special segment, Milk, Money and Manipulation, an exclusive from inside the Langford estate. The promo ran every hour on the hour. Viewers speculated wildly. Who spoke? Another maid? Security? Maybe the billionaire himself? Hashtags changed. Now it was in Langford leak and black milk scandal. Amira turned on the television once, just long enough to hear her name mispronounced, and her story reduced to tabloid punchlines. She turned it off and sat in darkness. In a quiet corner of the house, Gerald watched the promo with a smirk. He knew who gave the exclusive, because he made sure they called. A white conservative TV host announces an exclusive from someone inside the Langford mansion. They branded her a threat for caring too deeply, for being too black in the wrong place. The sunlight that spilled through the Langford estate's tall windows, the morning after the exclusive interview aired, did nothing to warm its cold, echoing halls. The news cycle hadn't slowed. It had only mutated. Overnight, Amara Baines had transformed from a silent caregiver into a cultural firestorm. Blogs dissected her expressions frame by frame. Anchors questioned her motivations with clinical arrogance. One panel on national television dared to ask, "Can a woman like her truly love a child like that?" She didn't sleep. She barely moved. The voices outside had grown louder, but the silence inside her was heavier. That morning, Preston entered her guest room for the second time in 2 days, but this time he didn't come with pity. He came with question. He closed the door softly behind him and stood for a moment, unsure of where to begin. She didn't rise from her seat by the window. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes were swollen, but dry. "I need to ask you something," Preston said, gently but directly. Amara looked at him, not with fear, but with weariness. "Why did you do it?" he asked. Her silence stretched. Then she turned her gaze back to the window, to the people on the other side of the iron gates, to the banners and bullhorns and the swarm of voices demanding versions of her story. "I didn't plan it," she began, voice soft but firm. "It wasn't some scheme to seduce your child or your legacy, or your name." Preston didn't move. Amara took a breath, then exhaled slowly. "I lost my own son, 6 years ago. His name was Isaiah." Something flickered in Preston's eyes. He hadn't expected this. "I was working at a hospital in Atlanta," she continued. "He had a fever. Nothing life-threatening, but they kept passing me around, telling me to wait, telling me other kids were sicker. I knew something was wrong, but they didn't believe me. They don't listen when black mothers worry." She paused. "By the time they examined him, his organs were failing. He died on a plastic bed while I watched a nurse eat vending machine chips behind a curtain." Preston's jaw clenched. He lowered himself into a nearby chair, folding his hands together, still listening.
"I came here to work. That's all. But when Miles screamed like that, I felt Isaiah. Again. Not just the pain, the urgency, the helplessness. My body just remembered."
Tears welled in her eyes, but did not fall. Holding your son wasn't defiance. It was instinct, and grief, and something so human, it frightens people. "Like you're bored." Preston swallowed hard. His throat burned with an emotion he couldn't name, something beyond guilt or shock. It was recognition. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" he asked. "Because in places like this," she whispered, Our grief is never seen as grief. It's labeled as threat, and now you see what they've done with it. Preston sat still, words caught in his throat. For the first time since Eleanor's death, he didn't feel like the richest man in the room. He felt small, unsteady. By midday, the board of Langford International convened an emergency video conference. The faces of wealthy men and women filled a 90-inch screen in Preston's office, polished, powerful, and furious. "You need to fire her, Preston," barked one. "She's destabilizing the brand," added another. "Release a statement. Condemn the act. Cut ties," someone demanded. "She's a liability now, not a maid," a woman said, voice sharp like glass. Preston didn't flinch. He stared back at them, unimpressed. "And if I don't?" he asked, voice even. The screen went silent. "Then we release a statement ourselves," said the chairperson coolly. "And you'll find yourself not just without our support but under board review." Preston leaned back, eyes narrowing. "She saved my son from an empty house and a broken father, and now you want me to reduce her to a mistake? Perception is power," the chairperson snapped. He ended the call without another word. Meanwhile, Amara's family gathered in her mother's modest apartment back in Savannah. Her younger brother Dorian paced the living room, furious, chain texting her while the news looped in the background. "You need to get out of there," her mother said, arms crossed, worry deep in her creased forehead. "These people ain't gonna protect you." "She's not gonna leave that baby," Dorian snapped. "She's in too deep." "That baby ain't hers," their aunt said from the corner. "Feels like he is," Dorian muttered. Back at the estate, Amara stared at her phone as their messages poured in. Warnings. Please. Worry twisted into commands. And still she stayed. Not because she felt safe, but because Miles now reached for her in the night, whispering "Mama" in his sleep, like it had always been true. She had crossed a boundary she never meant to touch. But now that she had, how could she leave him standing on the other side? The next afternoon, a knock came at Preston's door. It was his assistant, pale and stiff. "Sir, there's something you need to see." She handed him a sealed envelope. Official, cold and heavy. He tore it open. The words struck like a blade.
Petition for emergency custody hearing, filed by Meredith and Lawrence St. James.
His late wife's parents. The letter inside laid out their position, that Miles was being emotionally manipulated by a member of the household, that the footage indicated inappropriate maternal behavior, that the child was being raised in a racially unstable, psychologically confusing environment, that Preston's judgment was compromised. "They want custody," he said aloud, the room spinning. "They think I'm unfit." Then he saw the final line. Requesting full removal of Miles Langford from current residence until the matter is resolved. He stood slowly, the paper crumpling in his hands. Outside, Miles cried, soft, distant, innocent. Inside, the world turned cruel again. Preston receives legal documents. His estranged in-laws want custody of Miles and cite emotional manipulation by Amara. They would rather give the child to strangers than let a black woman love him. The envelope lay on Preston's desk like a loaded weapon, clinical, sharp, and aimed not just at him but at the very foundation of everything he thought he controlled. As he reread the petition, the legal jargon barely veiled the deeper message. You are unfit, because you let her get too close. His in-laws, Meredith and Lawrence St. James, weren't strangers to wealth or judgment. They had opposed his marriage to Eleanor quietly, then mourned her loudly when she died, transforming grief into a campaign of superiority. But this petition wasn't just a power play. It was a character assassination, not just of Preston, but of Amara. The words danced with coded language, inappropriate familiarity, emotional instability within the home, lack of racial congruity between caregiver and child. The footage was Exhibit A, the online backlash. Exhibit B, the final claim. Miles was bonding too deeply with an unauthorized maternal figure, one whose background lacks the emotional clarity necessary for a child of this standing. It wasn't even subtle. Preston sat at the head of his polished desk, his lawyer beside him, lips tight and voice restrained. They're painting this as neglect, Preston. A failure to protect the child from inappropriate attachments. You need to act quickly. You're suggesting I settle? Preston asked, voice low but dangerous. I'm suggesting, the lawyer replied carefully, that you take distance from her. Preston didn't respond. He stood slowly, walked to the window overlooking the estate grounds. Protesters still lined the gates, now carrying signs with both his name and hers. One sign read, Let love live. Another, she's not the problem. Racism is. The wind whispered against the glass. He turned. What if I don't? Then we go to war, the lawyer replied. And you better hope public opinion swings in your favor. Right now it's split down the middle. Preston made his decision the next morning. He hired a high-level crisis PR team, led by a black woman with a background in restorative justice narratives. No victim blaming, he instructed. We tell the truth. My son was comforted. I made mistakes. But I won't let them bury her for loving my child. The team moved quickly, drafting statements, scrubbing headlines, arranging interviews. They pitched a reframe. A motherless child finds comfort in unexpected arms. The world, they argued, needed less fear and more nuance. And maybe, just maybe, it would listen. But inside the mansion, that truth struggled to breathe. Preston invited Amara to move into a quieter wing, one farther from the eyes and ears of bitter staff, and closer to where Miles now slept. Just until the heat dies down, he said gently. She looked at him, searching. You still trust me? He nodded. With the most important thing I have. And yet, despite the gesture, the air in the mansion turned bitter. Staff who once offered polite nods now refused to meet her eyes. One cook stopped speaking to her altogether. A young groundskeeper, who had once joked with her about their shared love of jazz, now whispered loudly to a maid. She's milking this for more than sympathy. Doors closed just before she entered rooms. Conversations died the moment she passed. It wasn't physical violence. It was the slow freezing of a house into moral exile. One night, Amara stood in the dim hallway outside Miles' room. The door was slightly ajar. He had called for her again, softly, Mama, in a broken half-dream. She had gone to him, sung him to sleep, then stood there in the stillness, her hand on the frame, unsure if she was more guardian or ghost. She didn't hear Preston behind her. I meant it, he said. She turned, startled. When I said I trust you, she nodded, then lowered her voice. They don't. He paused. They didn't trust Eleanor either. Not when she chose to marry someone outside their tax bracket. And now they think they own her son. Amara looked away. They don't want me here. But he does, Preston replied, glancing into the room where Miles now slept, his tiny chest rising and falling peacefully. Do you? She asked, her voice quiet but edged. He looked at her, really looked, and said nothing. The following afternoon, the world outside boiled over. Dorian Baines, Amara's 17-year-old brother, had taken a bus from Savannah and joined the growing crowd at the Langford gates. He held a hand-painted sign that read, "Protect Black Caregivers." The cameras found him instantly. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't violent. But when a Langford security guard pushed too close, accusing him of inciting the crowd, Dorian pushed back with words. That's all it took. Within moments, he was tackled. Not by police, but by private security hired by the Langford board. Their excuse? Trespassing on a restricted perimeter. Footage of his arrest went viral within minutes. A black teenager in handcuffs, his sign trampled beneath black boots, surrounded by wealth and white fences. Inside the estate, Amara was holding Miles when she saw the footage. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply handed the baby to a nanny and walked to her room, closing the door behind her with quiet finality. Preston saw the footage moments later, and for the first time his hands trembled. Because what began as a scandal had now become a movement. And movements don't end with silence. Amara's younger brother Dorian is arrested during a protest defending her. He spoke for his sister, and the system silenced him like it always has. Young black men. The holding cell smelled of bleach and forgotten futures. Dorian Baines sat on the edge of a cracked bench, wrists cuffed, his right cheek bruised from a shove that hadn't made it into any of the public-facing footage. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't yelling. But still, they had thrown him down like he was made of threat, not bone. Name? The officer had snapped at intake. Dorian Baines. Charges? Inciting violence. Obstructing justice. Resisting arrest. The words were mechanical, pasted on like decals. Outside the precinct, his face flooded every screen. One headline read, "Black teen causes chaos at Langford Mansion protest." Another, "Sisters scandal, brother's arrest." None mentioned that he was unarmed. None mentioned that his sign had said protect, not destroy. At the Langford estate, Amara dropped to the floor the moment she saw the arrest footage. Her knees buckled, her mouth opened but no sound came. Miles, startled by her fall, began crying in the nanny's arms. Preston rushed to her, but she pushed him back with a sob caught halfway between rage and despair. "Why is this happening again?" she choked. "He didn't do anything. He's just a child." Her voice shook the room. "He's not their image of a child," Preston said quietly. "He's black. He's loud. And he's visible." Amara glared at him, through tears. "He's me all over again. Do you understand that now? It's not about Miles. It's not about milk. It's about the skin we're in." Preston looked away. He didn't know how to carry the weight of her truth. But he would try. He assembled his top attorneys within the hour. 3 corporate lawyers, 1 civil rights advisor, 1 crisis strategist. The goal: get Dorian out. Fast. But the Hampton County District Attorney's Office wasn't budging. "There's AI surveillance," the DA stated flatly over Zoom. The system tagged Mr. Baines as high risk based on movement patterns, gestures, and historical protest metadata. Preston leaned forward, incredulous. "You're saying an algorithm decided he's a danger?" "Yes," the DA said, unblinking. "The software is trained on thousands of protest behaviors: fist raising, body positioning, tonal aggression. It flagged him. We cannot override that easily." "That system was trained on decades of racially skewed data," the civil rights advisor interjected. The DA shrugged. "We use what works." Amara watched from the edge of the room, hands balled so tightly that her knuckles went white. Her brother wasn't just in jail. He was trapped in a machine built to mistake him for a problem. Later that evening, Amara sat alone in the nursery, the soft hum of the nightlight casting shadows across the walls. Miles lay sleeping in the crib. But she didn't look at him. Her eyes were closed, lips trembling in whispered prayer. "I can't save them both," she murmured. "God, I can't. I'm one woman. I can't." Her voice cracked, the sound of a mother breaking under a weight no mother should ever bear. The door creaked. She turned, expecting Preston. It wasn't him. It was Gerald. He stood in the doorway like a ghost, calm, uninvited, and too still. Amara stood quickly, placing herself between him and the crib. "What do you want?" she asked, voice low. Gerald stepped in, glancing briefly at the sleeping child. "I'm not here for him."
Then leave.
But he didn't. "I can get your brother out," he said evenly. "No trial. No record. No bail required. Just gone. Like it never happened." Amara's breath hitched. "How?" "I still have friends in the system. I know judges. I know people who owe me favors. All I need to do is pick up the phone." She hesitated. Her heart thudded against her ribs. "What's the catch?" she asked. Gerald looked at her fully now. His eyes were cold, but not cruel. Just resolved. "You walk away," he said. "From this house. From Miles. From Preston. From this circus. You disappear quietly. No press. No goodbye." Amara's voice dropped. "You want me gone?" "I want peace," he said simply. "And your presence here won't allow it. This family wasn't built for your kind of love." Amara took a slow step forward, fury and heartbreak dancing behind her eyes. "You think because you wore a badge, you know justice? You're the system that locked up my brother. I'm the system that can unlock him." She didn't speak. Her breath came faster. Her hands trembled. Gerald nodded slowly, then backed away toward the hall. "Clock's ticking," he said. "Don't take too long." And then he was gone, leaving only silence and the impossible choice. Gerald reappears, offering to drop all charges against Dorian if Amara walks away from Miles. 5. The custody trap. Amara didn't sleep that night. She sat curled in the corner of the nursery, eyes fixed on the shadows crawling across the walls, while Miles slept soundly in his crib beside her. The moonlight carved thin silver lines across his face, innocent and unbothered, his tiny chest rising and falling in peace. In the stillness, he murmured a single word, soft and half-formed, "Mama." It was a sound she hadn't expected, one that felt like both a miracle and a knife. Outside, Gerald's offer looped like a haunting refrain. Dorian's freedom, in exchange for her disappearance. She could save her brother, but the price was the child who made her feel like a mother again. Her phone buzzed with a video message. It was from inside the jail. She opened it with trembling fingers and saw Dorian, seated behind scratched plexiglass, his young face hardened by pain, but not defeat. "Sis," he began, eyes direct and voice steady, "don't lose your soul for me. If you walk away from that boy, they win." And I don't want to be the reason you forget who you are. Her tears blurred the screen. The guilt was suffocating. She set the phone down, and just then, a knock came. Preston stepped in gently, his face drawn. I heard, he said, referring to Gerald's proposition. Amara didn't answer. He had no right, Preston added firmly. If he pulls another move like that, I'll have him tied up in litigation, until he forgets how to spell his own name. Amara stared at him, hollow. You think you can solve this with threats? She asked. You don't understand what it means to be asked to choose between your blood and your heart. Preston lowered his gaze. Then let me help. But she cut in. You can't, because no matter what you do, this ends with someone I love being hurt. Later that day, Amara visited Dorian. They sat separated by glass, holding phones to their ears. You look tired, he said. You look older, she replied with a sad smile. Jail do that, she sighed. They're giving me a way to make this go away. Dorian didn't flinch. Gerald, she nodded. He says he can clear it all, erase it. Dorian leaned in. At what cost? Amara hesitated. Miles, I'd have to walk away. Quietly, Dorian's face hardened. No, absolutely not. But you. I'd rather rot here than watch you erase yourself from the one person who sees you. Who needs you? Her lips trembled. You're still my baby, and you're his now, he said. Don't let the world rewrite that. Back at the mansion, Preston prepped for a press conference. He stood before a sleek podium, press buzzing like flies, cameras trained on his every breath. This was supposed to be his moment of control to change the narrative, defend Amara, protect Miles. But just as he was about to speak, his assistant stormed in, pale and breathless. They leaked her credentials, she whispered. Her nursing license. It was for Preston's heart plummeted. The headlines were already forming before he could open his mouth. Maid lied about her past. She held his baby, and a secret. The flashbulbs lit up like judgment. And Amara, who had already lost so much, was about to lose the one thing she never intended to lie about. Preston prepares for a press conference. But someone leaks documents showing Amara's past as a nurse was forged. Her secret was meant to open doors. Now it's closing everyone around her. The headlines hit harder than any punch Amara had ever known. Maid lied about credentials. Ex-nurse never licensed. Another one followed. From hero to fraud. The shocking truth behind the woman who held the billionaire's baby. And just like that, the fragile ground she had been trying to stand on vanished beneath her. She stood in the center of the guest wing, her phone buzzing non-stop in her hand, trembling with a mix of shame, rage, and disbelief. The very thing she had buried so carefully sealed, forgotten, necessary, had surfaced at the worst possible moment. Not as context, but as condemnation. She didn't need to guess who leaked it. Gerald had promised she would regret staying. Preston confronted her gently but directly. He didn't raise his voice, but the air between them was tight with betrayal. Is it true? He asked, voice low, eyes steady. Amara didn't deflect. She nodded slowly, every part of her body radiating exhaustion. I was licensed once, she said. Legitimately. I trained. I passed everything. So what happened, he asked. I told the truth, she whispered, biting back the bitterness. That's what happened. And then for the first time she told him the full story. Years ago, she had worked at a mid-level hospital in Atlanta. She loved the work, despite the long shifts and low pay. But one night, a newborn coded during surgery. And it wasn't just a tragic complication. It was preventable. A senior surgeon had reused faulty equipment against protocol. She reported it, filed it through the proper channels. But instead of applause, she got buried. They claimed she falsified documents, accused her of overstepping, alleged that she had misunderstood the procedure. And when she refused to retract her report, they launched an internal review that left her stripped of her license and blackballed from every major hospital in the region. Her appeals failed. The story never made the news, but it spread quietly among institutions like a stain. I applied for jobs for over a year, she told Preston, voice cracking. Cleaning homes, babysitting, anything. But the minute they saw my background, doors shut in my face. I forged my credentials not to cheat, but to survive. I just needed someone to believe I was still capable. Preston listened, unmoving, but not unfeeling. You should have told me, he said finally. She gave a humorless laugh. You wouldn't have hired me. He didn't deny it, but he didn't walk away either. The media didn't care for nuance. Her truth didn't come with enough polish. It didn't have a blue checkmark or a polished publicist. So they twisted it. Daytime talk shows dragged her character, while right-wing commentators called her dangerous, delusional, and unstable. One viral tweet read, "So she lied to get close to a rich white baby. What else is she hiding?" Another said, "This is why vetting matters. Imagine if she was a man." Public support, once loud and viral, began to crack. Even some who had defended her grew distant, uncomfortable. They didn't know what to do with a woman who had been both brave and broken. Social media wanted saints or villains. Amara was neither. Preston tried to shield her from the noise. He shut down interviews, cut ties with outlets that framed her unfairly. But it wasn't enough. The truth had already been digested by an audience that preferred its heroes flawless. Amara could feel the distance growing between her and the world, and maybe even between her and Preston. His eyes still softened when he looked at her, but they no longer lingered as long. Then came the moment she decided to take control. She contacted a journalist from a nationally syndicated interview show, a black woman, trusted fair. And she asked for one thing: to speak without interruption. No edits. No framing. Just her voice. The segment aired on a quiet Tuesday evening, sitting in a simple chair with no makeup and no PR prep. Amara told the country what had happened, from the malpractice she tried to expose, to the blackballing, to the forged credentials, and why she never saw herself as a criminal. "I didn't want to lie," she said, looking straight into the camera. "But sometimes this country gives black women two choices: silence or survival. And I chose to survive. Because if I stayed silent, Isaiah, my son, would be the last child I ever tried to save." The broadcast drew 14 million viewers in 24 hours. Some wept, some applauded, but some doubled down, calling her calculated, media-trained, manipulative. Amara had told the truth, and the world responded with a shrug. The next morning, Preston received a knock on his office door. His assistant stepped in, tablet in hand, face unreadable. "You need to see this," she said. It was an email from a high-profile family, the Van Marstons. Old wealth, famous for their charities, their curated Instagram perfection, and their influence in elite adoption circles. They'd watched the interview, and they had a solution. "We'd be honored to adopt Miles," the message read, "to relieve both parties of this tension. Our home is stable. He'll be safe, loved, private." There was even a photo attached. Their white picket fence gleamed. Their smiles didn't. Preston stared at the screen, frozen. Not from shock but from fury. They wanted to solve the scandal by erasing the woman who started it all. And suddenly, he realized, this wasn't just about Amara anymore. This was about a system that couldn't stomach a black woman being needed, and believed, a wealthy white family offers to adopt Miles and relieve both parties of this tension. Not all kindness is pure, especially when it wants to erase history. Their smiles were perfect. That's what Amara noticed first. In the carefully arranged photo attached to the email Preston received, the Van Marstons stood in front of a sprawling estate, with 3 adopted children, each from different backgrounds, each dressed like they'd stepped out of a catalog. Julia Van Marston wore a crisp white blouse and soft pearls. Her husband, Gregory, donned a tailored sweater and thin-rimmed glasses that gave him the air of a philosopher. They looked polished, charitable, the kind of white people who quoted Maya Angelou at dinner parties, but locked their doors twice when driving through Harlem. The message was short, but drenched in condescension. "We would be honored to relieve the Langford family and Miss Baines of this ongoing public burden. Miles deserves stability, privacy, and safety, not scandal. We believe we are best positioned to provide that." There was even a closing line dripping in benevolence. "We admire Miss Baines' devotion, but she has done enough." Done enough? Preston read the message twice, then a third time, and with each pass, something inside him cracked wider. This wasn't generosity. It was an erasure dressed as rescue. They were offering to solve the problem by removing the black woman from the child she soothed, while pretending it was a gift. He didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, he forwarded the message to Amara. She read it in silence, her eyes scanning the lines slowly, each word feeling like another wound. She didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, she looked up and said, "They want to buy absolution, and use him as the receipt." Preston's voice was tight. "They framed it as help." "No," Amara whispered. "They framed it as charity, because they think I'm a blemish." The board, however, had other opinions. Preston's phone rang for hours. Emails poured in. Urgent subject lines. Crisis solution. Public optics. Containment opportunity. One board member said it plainly. If this goes on, we're going to bleed out. Accept the Van Marston offer, and we close the loop. Cleanly, quietly. Preston answered that call with a single sentence. He's not a storyline. But the pressure didn't stop. Amara, meanwhile, felt something deeper, a slow unraveling inside her. The interviews, the shame, the headlines, the press conference fallout. It had all taken something from her. She moved slower, ate less. Her hands trembled when she poured Miles' bottle. Her sleep was fractured into shallow pieces. And now, with this adoption offer looming, she felt like history was folding in on itself again. They had done this to women like her before. Nannies, wet nurses, housekeepers, used them to cradle and calm, then tossed them aside when their existence became inconvenient. You see what they're doing, right? She said to Preston one morning, her voice barely above a whisper. They're writing a story where I'm the complication, the before photo, and they're the polished ending. Preston nodded slowly. They think they're the cure. But I'm not a disease, she said. I'm a mother. In every way but blood. He stared at her, then at Miles, who had just toddled toward Amara, arms outstretched. Preston knew in that moment that giving him away would be more than loss. It would be betrayal, not just of Amara, but of Eleanor's memory, because Eleanor had believed in hard truths and inconvenient love. She would never have chosen a clean photo over a raw, beautiful fight. Still, the world outside raged on. Protesters still gathered. News cycles kept spinning. And Amara's body kept unraveling. It happened on a Monday morning. She had just finished feeding Miles, his fingers playing with the collar of her worn shirt, when her vision blurred. She tried to stand, but the room tilted. Her knees buckled before she could speak. The bottle slipped from her hand and shattered on the hardwood floor, and then nothing. When she woke up, the lights above her were sterile and bright. A monitor beeped steadily. A nurse adjusted her IV. Preston sat beside her, worry carved into every line of his face. She blinked slowly. Where's Miles? He's okay, Preston said quickly. With the nanny, he's asking for you. She tried to sit up, but the nurse gently pushed her back. You collapsed from exhaustion, the nurse explained. Malnourishment. Stress. You haven't been eating. Your body gave out. Amara stared at the ceiling. I can't give up, she whispered. Preston leaned forward. You're not. Then the doctor entered. She looked at Amara with practiced calm and quiet caution. We ran a full panel. There's something else. Amara's eyes darted up. You're pregnant. Time stopped. The beeping slowed. The air in the room thickened. Amara's lips parted. No, that's not. It's early, the doctor said, but it's certain. Preston's eyes widened, but he said nothing. Amara stared straight ahead, her world unraveling again, but in a direction she never expected. Amara collapses from exhaustion, and doctors reveal something shocking. The hospital room was steeped in the kind of sterile quiet that made every breath feel borrowed. Amara lay motionless on the bed, eyes fixed on a crack running across the ceiling like a fault line between two lives before and after. The words still hung in the air, heavier than the IV drip beside her. You're pregnant. The doctor had delivered it gently, cautiously, but it didn't soften the weight. She hadn't even considered the possibility. Her mind immediately flashed to him, the man from a short-lived, uneven relationship before she came to the Langford estate. He'd left quietly, the kind of man who disappeared when a woman's life grew too complex for his comfort. She had buried the disappointment quickly, moved on, survived. But now his absence was echoed by a presence growing inside her. Another child, another reason to fear and hope in the same breath. When Preston returned that evening, he entered the room like someone stepping into grief, not his own, careful, uncertain, but present. He brought no flowers, no forced comfort, just silence and sincerity. Amara didn't acknowledge him at first. Her body faced the window, her thoughts far beyond it. He sat quietly beside her bed, unsure how to bridge the new chasm between them. I don't know what to say, he finally admitted. She let out a bitter laugh, small and sharp. That's a first. Her tone wasn't cruel. It was tired. Tired of pretending that strength wasn't costing her. Tired of holding everything up alone. He watched her fingers curl tightly around the edge of the blanket, knuckles white, the rest of her still. You should hate me, she whispered. I don't, he said, soft but firm. You should. I lied. I brought chaos into your house. He shook his head. You brought love into a house that didn't know what it looked like anymore. Her eyes finally met his. Then why does it feel like I'm the villain in a story I never asked to be part of? He didn't have an answer, but he stayed. As doctors explained her condition, how stress and fatigue had endangered not just her health but the life she didn't yet understand. Preston felt something shift inside him. She had risked everything for a child that wasn't biologically hers. And now, carrying another, she lay powerless, again reduced to a name in someone else's headlines. Yet still she protected. Still she endured. When the doctors left, Amara whispered, barely audible, "I'm not ready." Her voice cracked not from fear but from knowing that motherhood for her had never come in clean lines or expected moments. It came with loss, with grief, with sacrifice. Preston stayed through the night. He didn't sleep. He watched over her, like a man learning what it meant to witness, not just observe but truly see. He thought of Eleanor, his late wife, and how the world had celebrated her beauty, but ignored her vulnerability. He remembered the night she wept over a miscarriage no one else even knew about. How she whispered, "Even my grief feels borrowed." He hadn't understood then. He did now. Sitting beside Amara, watching her battle shame and silence in the same breath, he understood that he'd spent his life surrounded by powerful women whose power had gone unseen. Amara, raw and unfiltered, was more mother than most who had raised heirs in his world. She didn't have money, protection, or even certainty, but she had devotion, and it terrified the very system trying to crush her. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the Langford estate, like a spotlight preparing a stage. Staff bustled with last-minute preparations for the company's annual gala. It was supposed to be a celebration, a public image reboot after weeks of scandal. Flowers were flown in from Italy, the guest list trimmed to A-list names, speeches rehearsed and rewritten. But Preston had his own script, and no one knew it. He stood backstage in a black tuxedo, holding a folded piece of paper. Not even his assistant had seen the speech. On the other side of the curtain, the ballroom swelled with elite donors, media giants, and polished opportunists. Some who had called Amara a criminal now sat sipping champagne under banners that read resilience, renewal. Preston adjusted his cufflinks, took a breath and whispered to himself, "This is where it ends." Preston announces a stunning decision at his company's annual gala. The ballroom glistened with wealth. Every chandelier humming above a sea of pressed tuxedos and sequined gowns. Waiters glided between clusters of CEOs, politicians and celebrity investors carrying trays of wine that cost more than the average worker's rent. Every guest had come expecting spectacle, something polished and safe. Some had heard whispers that Preston Langford III might announce a charitable initiative or even quietly step down in exchange for corporate calm. A handful of reporters clutched pre-written headlines like "Langford rebuilds legacy after breastfeeding scandal." But none of them were prepared for what was about to happen. Preston stood behind the heavy curtain, one hand on the edge of the velvet drape, the other clutching a single folded sheet of paper. His speech, handwritten, no teleprompter, no PR vetting, just behind him. His assistant watched nervously, while his crisis manager mouthed silent objections, gripping the updated statement they'd crafted for him. Safe language, balanced optics, careful tones. Preston never looked back. When his name was announced, the applause was restrained, but polite. The scandal had cooled but not disappeared, and everyone in the room wanted resolution, not a revolution. But as Preston stepped into the spotlight, he didn't blink. His voice, when it came, was steady. "I was supposed to give you a speech tonight about stability, about growth, about putting the past behind us," he began, eyes scanning the room. "But that would be a lie, and we've all lived in enough lies lately." A ripple moved through the room. Forks stilled midair, faces tensed. "What happened inside my home was never just a scandal. It was a reckoning, a mirror held up to power. My power, and I didn't like what I saw." He unfolded the page, looked down for a moment, then folded it again and set it aside. "I'm not here tonight to protect my image. I'm here to surrender it." The crowd stilled, breath collectively caught. "Effective immediately, I am resigning as CEO of Langford International, and I'm donating 98% of my personal wealth to anti-racist education, maternal health access, and Black legal defense organizations, including the fund representing Dorian Baines, who never should have seen the inside of a cell." Silence dropped like a guillotine. One man stood and walked out, face red. A woman whispered, "He's lost his mind." But from the back, A single clap began. Then another. A few stood. Then more. Half the room erupted into a standing ovation. The other half scowled in stunned, betrayed silence. Preston didn't wait for consensus. This company will go on without me. But I won't be remembered as the man who stood silent while a black woman was crucified for doing what no one else dared to do. Love my son like he mattered. I failed to protect her, but I won't fail to follow her example. He stepped down from the stage, not toward the waiting press but toward the side door. His phone vibrated in his pocket, dozens of alerts firing in real time. Headlines exploded. Preston Langford resigns in stunning rebuke of corporate culture. Savior or showman, internet divided over Langford's exit. Langford walks away from fortune, into the fire. The news had barely reached its peak when another story broke. Amara watched the gala from the hospital room TV, silent tears streaming down her face. The speech left her breathless, suspended in that strange space between relief and disbelief. Miles lay beside her in the crib, sleeping peacefully, unaware that the man who had once dismissed his cries had now dismantled his empire in his name. She covered her mouth with one hand and sobbed quietly, overwhelmed not by Preston's wealth or sacrifice, but by the simple truth in his voice. He had finally seen her, not just as a maid, or a nurse, or a scandal, but as a mother. A nurse entered softly, carrying a freshwater pitcher. He really did it, she said gently. The whole room looked like it stopped breathing. Amara nodded slowly, wiping her tears. He gave up everything, for the right thing. The nurse smiled and left her alone again. Amara turned back to the screen, watching the replays, the pundits arguing, the tweets flying. For a moment it felt like justice wasn't a fairy tale. Then her phone rang. She almost didn't answer it, but the number was her mother's. When she picked up, all she heard was screaming. Amara, it's gone. Oh God, it's gone. Her mother's voice was frantic, breathless. What's gone? Amara sat up, chest tight. The house. Our house. Someone set it on fire. Me and Dorian barely made it out. It's all gone, baby. Everything's gone. Amara's blood ran cold. Her breathing turned shallow. She looked down at her arms, trembling. Miles stirred. Everything Preston had done. Everything she'd endured. The truth. The baby. The sacrifice. And still, they came with fire. Dorian's case is dismissed, but someone sets fire to Amara's family home. The smell of smoke still clung to Amara's clothes days later. It had threaded itself into her skin, her thoughts, her sleep. Even after the ashes cooled and the fire trucks pulled away, the truth of it stayed burning. Her family home in Savannah, where she had once cradled Isaiah on sleepless nights, where she'd folded laundry with her mother, while Dorian practiced protest chants in the hallway, was now nothing more than soot and memory. The fire marshal called it suspicious but inconclusive. No suspects, no arrests, just another black family with charred dreams and no answers. Faulty wiring, they said, with deadpan professionalism. But Amara knew, she knew hate had fingerprints too subtle for white gloves. And this wasn't coincidence. It was retaliation dressed in smoke. Preston stood beside her when she returned from the hospital, arms tight at his sides, jaw clenched. He had offered his lawyers, his private investigators, his security detail, but none of it could restore what had been taken. Amara declined all of it, except one thing, a quiet cottage on the edge of his estate, nestled in a forgotten garden of wild rosemary and untamed ivy. It's yours, he said simply. No cameras, no noise, just peace. She didn't speak, she only nodded, the silence between them heavy with a kind of gratitude words couldn't carry. The cottage was small, but sunlight pooled through every window like an offering. The floor creaked with the weight of age, not neglect. The fireplace was cracked, but warm. She moved in with just 2 bags, a few worn clothes, a baby monitor, a photo of Isaiah, and a tiny pair of shoes Miles had outgrown, but refused to part with. At night she'd sit by the window, wrapped in one of Eleanor's old shawls, watching fireflies blink like prayers across the yard. Miles took his first steps there. It was early morning. She had been feeding him near the open door, humming an old lullaby when he wriggled out of her lap and stood wobbly, uncertain, bold. Miles, she whispered, half frozen with awe. He looked at her, then grinned, and stumbled forward 1 step, then 2, until he crashed gently into her arms. She laughed and then cried, and then laughed again, cradling him as if he'd crossed a continent rather than the rug between them. He nestled into her shoulder, cooing softly. You did it, she whispered into his ear. You walked right into love. Every part of her wanted to freeze the moment. Not because it was perfect, but because it was theirs. No headlines, no hashtags, just a boy and the woman the world tried to erase from his story. With slow intention, she began to rebuild. She found a part-time job at a local literacy center, working with children who didn't know they were being overlooked. On weekends, she volunteered at a clinic for uninsured mothers, whispering encouragements Amara once needed and never heard. The community began to recognize her not as the woman from the footage, but as Amara, the woman who knelt to tie shoelaces, who remembered birthdays, who refused to walk away. Preston visited often, though never uninvited. He brought books for Miles, handmade soaps from Eleanor's favorite shop, and sometimes, just silence. He never tried to fix anymore. He just showed up. One evening, as they sat outside on the porch, Amara asked, "Do you ever regret it? Walking away from all that power?" Preston sipped his tea slowly before answering. Power is only power when it protects the right people. What I had wasn't power. It was armor, and I wore it too long. She nodded, and for the first time in a long while, they simply watched the stars. Not in search of answers, but in reverence of the questions. Then came the knock. It was a Sunday. Amara had just finished bathing Miles, wrapping him in a towel that still smelled of lavender and milk. She opened the door to find a woman holding a camera and a soft smile followed by a man adjusting sound equipment. Behind them stood a familiar face. Nyla Garcia, a filmmaker known for telling stories that made the world listen. "Miss Baines," Nyla said gently, "I've been following your journey, quietly, respectfully, and I think the world needs to hear it, from you." Amara stepped back, unsure, cautious. Nyla continued, "No edits, no slant, just truth. Your words, your lens." Amara looked down at Miles, then back at the woman. She had run from the spotlight, been burned by it, erased by it, but now, maybe it was time to reclaim it. A documentary crew offers to tell her story to the world. The title was simple, but it echoed like scripture. Milk and fire. Black serif letters against a white screen. No soundtrack. Just breath. That was the opening moment of the documentary. Stark, deliberate, and unflinching. Directed by Nyla Garcia. Shot over 8 months. And shaped by more than 200 hours of interviews. Milk and Fire didn't just tell a story. It unearthed one. It unspooled the truth the headlines had tried to flatten, and gave breath back to the woman they once labeled a scandal. When the lights dimmed at the Sundance premiere, no one in the audience knew what they were about to feel. But by the end of the first 10 minutes, silence had blanketed the theater, not the stillness of disinterest, but the stillness of impact. Amara's voice, calm but trembling, narrated the opening sequence, a wide shot of the ashes of her childhood home, overlaid with footage of Miles taking his first steps in the cottage. "They tried to burn me down," she says, "but forgot I was already fired." Audiences wept openly. Grown men wiped their cheeks beside corporate executives, trying not to sniff too loudly. Black mothers clutched tissues in trembling hands, murmuring, "Yes, baby." When Amara described holding Miles through sleepless nights, her own trauma stitched into every lullaby. There was fury too, rage that rose in the room like steam, when the footage cut to pundits mocking her, memes making a mockery of her care, a courtroom sketch of Dorian in shackles. One woman in the crowd audibly gasped when the documentary revealed the Van Marston family's adoption offer, worded like a press release, but carrying the tone of erasure. And then came the turn. In the third act, Nyla's lens moved in tight on Amara's hands, strong, calloused, scarred from years of invisible labor. She spoke of Miles, of motherhood that didn't begin with blood, but with recognition. "He looked at me like he knew I was already broken," Amara said, "and chose me anyway." The theater held its breath. By the end, when the credits rolled, no one moved. The applause didn't come in thunder. It came in waves. Quietly at first, then rising, wave after wave, until the entire room stood on its feet. People weren't just clapping. They were crying. They were awakening. Backstage, Amara sat alone in the green room, hands folded in her lap, tears dried on her cheeks. She hadn't watched the full cut until tonight. She hadn't wanted to relive it all at once. But now something in her felt lighter, still sore, still raw, but no longer invisible. Nyla entered gently, crouching beside her. "They heard you," she whispered. Finally, Amara nodded slowly. I didn't think I wanted them to. Not anymore. But you needed them to, Nyla said. And now they need you. What Amara didn't know, what she wouldn't find out until later, was that someone else had been in the theater too. Preston Langford sat in the back row, hidden beneath a plain navy suit, his one signature watch removed. No cameras caught him. No reporters noticed. He sat still the entire screening, jaw tight, hands clenched, watching his former self reflected in every cold hallway, every security feed, every quiet moment he had failed to act. When Amara told the story of Isaiah, Preston nearly stood. When she forgave Eleanor's family despite everything, he closed his eyes. But when Miles, now a toddler, was shown asleep against her chest in the closing scene, breathing in rhythm with the woman who had given him everything, Preston wept. It wasn't loud. It wasn't for show. But it was real. After the screening, he left through the side door. No statements. No questions. Just a man walking away from what he once built, towards something he still didn't fully understand. Back at the cottage, Amara returned to a small stack of mail, waiting at her doorstep. She sifted through it slowly. Flyers, bills, a note from a local student who'd seen the film, but tucked between them was a heavy envelope, cream-colored, with no return address. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, hand-folded. The handwriting was careful, slanted slightly right, youthful but precise. It read, "Dear Mama, I don't know how old I was when I first understood what you did for me, what you gave up, what you carried, but I know now, and I need you to know. I remember everything. I remember how your voice sounded when the world called you things I didn't understand yet. I remember your arms when I couldn't sleep. I remember the milk. I remember the fire. You didn't just save me. You built me, brick by brick, love by love. And wherever I go in this life, I go carrying your name. Love, Miles." Amara sat down, knees folding, the letter trembling in her hands. Not because it broke her, but because it completed something she never thought would be whole. A letter arrives from Miles' future, written by his adult self. The memoir arrived in the mail, wrapped in a thick layer of brown paper, no return address, no inscription on the package. Just a weight that felt familiar the moment Amara lifted it. She took it inside quietly, her second child asleep against her chest in a sling, her fingers trembling slightly as she peeled the paper back. The title read Sunlight, a Memoir of Becoming. The author's name bold and clear at the bottom of the cover, Miles Langford. Her throat tightened. The photograph on the back made her breath catch. It was a profile shot of him, now a young man in his 20s, with Eleanor's eyes, but Amara's quiet. His expression wasn't confident in the arrogant way people often mistook for strength. It was still, intentional. A face shaped by knowing things too early, by seeing the world not as it sold itself, but as it survived. She didn't read it at first. She held it. She walked around the cottage with it in her hands, letting the memory of his baby footsteps echo inside her chest. She laid it on the dining table while she cooked dinner. She carried it to the porch and sat with it while dusk fell across the trees. She watched her younger child crawl beside her, and for a long moment she was afraid. Afraid of what Miles might remember, afraid of what he might have forgotten, afraid of who she might be, in the pages of someone else's truth. But when night fell and the house went quiet, Amara finally opened the book. The dedication read, "For the woman who fed me before I had a name, and loved me before the world ever did." Page by page, sentence by sentence, her hands began to tremble. Miles didn't sensationalize what happened. He didn't retell the scandal, or ride the coattails of controversy. Instead, he wrote about silence, about the ache of needing something he couldn't name, as a child. About how he didn't remember much from those early months, just warmth, rhythm, and the smell of skin that wasn't his father's or mother's, but felt like home. "She was the first person," he wrote, "who taught me that love has no color, only weight, and hers held me steady when nothing else did." He described the lullabies, the nights he woke screaming, and found arms that didn't hesitate, the way she smelled like lavender in fear. How, even after the world threw her out of his life, he'd wake years later with her name in his mouth, and no one left to answer to it. The chapters moved like prayer, raw, painful, redemptive. When he described the day he found the footage again, older now, tech-savvy, hacking into an old drive of his father's, Amara gasped. He had seen it. He had watched it. As an adult, and instead of recoiling, he wept. "I finally understood what the world couldn't," he wrote. "That milk was love. That body was home. That moment was mine. Amara placed the book down and pressed her hand to her heart, which now beat with two memories, one from the past, and one nestled against her chest. Sunlight swept across the country like wildfire wrapped in poetry. It made headlines, trended across platforms, and ignited national conversations. Book clubs argued over it. College campuses hosted panels. Black mothers cried on TikTok. White readers debated discomfort. Pastors quoted it in sermons. Senators pretended to have read it. It was nominated for every major literary prize within weeks. But more than the awards, the memoir cracked something open about race, about care, about the fragility of womanhood in a system built to erase both struggle and sacrifice. One journalist described it as the story that shamed a nation and healed it in the same breath. Another wrote, "We often speak of chosen families. Sunlight shows us what happens when chosen mothers raise unchosen sons, and still call it love." Amara refused every interview. She stayed quiet, tucked in her little cottage, watching the world move around her like weather she couldn't control. Reporters knocked on her door. Filmmakers offered money for follow-ups. Universities begged for speaking engagements. She turned them all away. Her children needed peace. And she, for once, didn't need to be seen. Not because she feared attention, but because she'd finally been seen the way that mattered most. Then came the knock. It was a slow, uncertain rhythm. Not urgent, not expected. Her second child was asleep. The afternoon light had begun to fade, and the shadows outside were long, reaching across her front steps like fingers. She opened the door carefully, and froze. Standing before her was a face from a chapter she thought had closed long ago. Not Preston, not Gerald, not someone from court or protest or documentary. It was her mother. Older now, still strong, but smaller in spirit, dressed in the same church coat she used to wear on Sundays, that smelled of starch and faded memories. Her voice cracked. "May I come in?" A knock on the door. Someone from her past she never thought she'd see. Amara stood in the doorway, staring into the eyes that once turned away from her. Her mother looked smaller now, as if time and silence had carved away her defiance. There was no grand entrance, no embrace, just a pause, a held breath between generations, who had both loved too hard and hurt too quietly. "I almost didn't come," her mother whispered. Amara blinked slowly. "Then why did you?" Her mother looked down, hands trembling slightly. "Because I watched the film, then I read the book, and I realized, I left you when you needed a mother most." Amara's grip on the door softened. "I judged you for surviving in a way I was too scared to try." Her mother continued. "I let shame make a stranger out of my own daughter, and I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to look you in the eye and say what they did to you was evil. What you became in spite of it is holy." For the first time in years, Amara saw not judgment in her mother's face, but surrender. "Not weakness. Humility." She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said softly. They sat at the small table by the window. Amara brewed tea. The room smelled of lavender and cinnamon, of something safe and old. Her youngest child stirred in the back room. No one raised their voice. No one accused. They simply talked about the past, the silence, the years lost. Her mother confessed how fear of what people would think cost her a relationship with her own grandchildren. How she once believed silence was protection, only to realize it was a weapon handed to her by a world that had always demanded black women shrink in the name of dignity. "I see now," she said, tears sliding unchecked down her face. "They punished you because you dared to love in a way they couldn't define, and I punished you for letting the world see it." Amara reached across the table, took her hand, and held it. "I just wanted someone to choose me," she said quietly. Her mother nodded. "I do. Now, I do." Months passed. Spring returned to the garden, with unapologetic bloom, and the cottage transformed from shelter to seedbed. With the help of community leaders, healthcare activists, and Nyla Garcia's documentary team, Amara opened the doors of the Baines Center for Maternal Justice, a sanctuary for black women failed by the system, and for mothers whose pain had been written off as exaggeration. The building stood on land Preston Langford quietly donated, without press or plaque. Its walls were painted warm earth tones. Inside were lactation rooms, therapy spaces, and storytelling circles, where women's traumas weren't just heard, they were held. Amara didn't position herself as a hero. She was the founder, yes, but she was also its first patient, its first cry, its first wound. Every morning she'd walk the halls with a quiet steadiness, greeting staff and visitors alike, survivors of medical malpractice, young mothers afraid to speak up, grandmothers raising grandchildren because of systems designed to swallow their daughters whole. They came, and they healed, and Amara stood in the center, not as a savior, but as proof. Preston never tried to reclaim credit. He donated anonymously, declined interviews, and faded from public life. But once a month, he'd stop by the center, usually at night, after hours, just to walk the halls, to breathe the air of something that had risen from his failure. "Do you ever wish it went differently?" Amara asked him once. As they sat on the back porch overlooking the garden, Preston took a long breath. "Only in one way." She looked at him. "I wish I'd believed you sooner," he said. She nodded. "But now you build," she said, "and that's what matters." Years passed. Miles grew. He graduated top of his class from a prestigious university, earning degrees in both law and social ethics. His commencement speech was broadcast live, and when he stood on stage in his blue robe and gold honor cords, he carried no notes, only a photograph tucked into his sleeve. The crowd fell silent when he began. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for a woman the world tried to erase," he said. "She didn't just raise me. She built me, through scandal, through shame, through sacrifice." He pulled out the photo and held it up. "This is Amara Baines, my mother." The crowd erupted. Across the country, people watching from screens cried. But back at the cottage, Amara watched in quiet stillness, hand on her chest, the same spot she once pressed when Miles first called her mama. Her youngest child, now 6, sat beside her, beaming. "Can I be like him one day?" the child asked. Amara smiled. "You already are." And then one morning, sunlight cascading through the windows, the scent of fresh cornbread in the oven. Amara stepped outside with her cup of tea. What she saw stopped her cold. There were people. Everywhere. Hundreds of them.
Women in headscarves. Children holding flowers. Fathers with toddlers on their shoulders. College students in milk and fire hoodies. Grandmothers in wheelchairs. Midwives. Nurses. Survivors.
They stood silently at first. Then a single child stepped forward, holding a sign that read, "Thank you for loving when they didn't." And the chant began. Soft. Then swelling. "Amara. Amara." Tears slipped down her cheeks. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't prepared for this. But this was the full circle. Not fame. Not forgiveness. Legacy. If you've ever been silenced for doing the right thing, if you've ever watched someone punished just for caring, you know this pain. No one should be criminalized for compassion. Type yes if you believe love is not a crime. Subscribe if this broke your heart.